Never rescue these souls. The phrase sounds cruel until you look closely at what rescue actually does to the rescuer. We tend to think of saving someone as a morally good thing, a generous action. Yet, when you observe rescue in action, in offices, families, and friendships, a troubling element emerges. The rescuer often stands a little taller, speaks with a measured pace, and feels indispensable. Power subtly enters the picture, disguised as compassion. Back in 1975, psychologists Bibb Lawtain and John Darley found that the more people around, the less likely anyone is to offer help, a phenomenon called the bystander effect. The usual explanation is diffusion of responsibility. I've always been intrigued by another detail. When only one person is present and the victim clearly depends on them, the likelihood of helping shoots up. It's not just empathy at play. Single responsibility creates a sense of unique importance. You're not just one of many, you are essential. That transition from being optional to being necessary is powerful. The concept of savior complex has been discussed in clinical terms for years, but the language often softens the reality. It mentions things like self-esteem regulation and attachment patterns, but it rarely states the obvious. Rescuing establishes a hierarchy. The one who saves is placed above the one who is saved. Once that imbalance is created, it rarely disappears. Niccolò Machiavelli understood this well, even without the jargon of therapy. In The Prince Dash, he cautioned rulers against giving favors in ways that breed dependence without gratitude. He didn't romanticize mercy. He saw it as a form of currency. A favor, he implied, should create a bond. If it doesn't, it's wasted. The lesser quoted, darker implication is that a person who receives a favor isn't automatically loyal. They might feel humiliated by the reminder of their need. Rescue quietly creates a debt. Debt festers. I saw this dynamic at a mid-sized technology firm in 2018. A senior manager, let's call him Daniel, repeatedly shielded a talented but unpredictable employee from disciplinary action. Missed deadlines, aggressive emails, internal squabbles. Daniel stepped in each time, negotiating with HR and absorbing the political fallout. Publicly, it seemed like mentoring. Privately, Daniel said he believed in second chances. What he didn't realize was how the team viewed it. They didn't see generosity, but favoritism. The employee didn't feel gratitude, but a sense of immunity. 3 years later, when leadership reorganized, that same employee testified against Daniel during an internal review, portraying him as someone who enabled dysfunction. The career Daniel tried to protect ended up being his own, and he lost it. I didn't expect the reversal to be so complete, but here, theory meets reality. By repeatedly rescuing, Daniel signaled that standards were flexible, and he showed his own need to be the protector. This need was clear to everyone. Psychology might label this codependency, and that's partially true, but it's not the whole story. It treats the situation as a mutual emotional problem, avoiding the issue of power. Think about burnout data. In 2019, the World Health Organization classified burnout as a workplace issue. Surveys in the US and Europe show that managers who report the worst burnout are often those who describe themselves as always available and emotionally responsible for their teams. This is often praised, but constant rescuing creates a fragile system. When the rescuer collapses, there's no backup. Dependence has replaced real ability. In unhealthy romantic relationships, this pattern becomes even clearer. Studies of anxious avoidant attachment styles show that the anxious partner often does too much, solving problems, fixing things, stabilizing the relationship, while the avoidant partner does too little. The anxious partner feels morally superior, but constantly drained. They might say, "If I don't hold this together, everything will fall apart." It sounds noble, but it's also a way to control disguised as devotion. Here's the unsettling truth. Rescuing allows you to see another person as incapable, even if you don't admit it. You become the architect of their survival. Once you take on that role, you resist seeing proof that they can manage without you, as your own importance decreases if they no longer need you. Machiavelli wrote that a ruler must avoid being hated or despised. He argued that too much mercy can lead to disorder, which leads to contempt. He was talking about political states, but the principle applies to personal influence as well. When you repeatedly rescue someone from the results of their actions, you reduce the consequences of their actions. Without that restraint, the behavior gets worse, and when it leads to chaos, people blame the authority who allowed it. I've seen team members stay silent in meetings while a colleague consistently underperforms, protected by a well-meaning manager. Their silence wasn't agreement, it was calculation. They were assessing the manager's weakness. Compassion that overrides fairness doesn't make someone a hero. It undermines their credibility. Yet, if you ask rescuers why they do it, they rarely mention power. They talk about responsibility, kindness, and loyalty. They are sincere. That sincerity is what makes the dynamic so hard to spot. The ego doesn't announce itself as dominance. It presents itself as virtue. In a Stanford experiment in the early 1970s, participants assigned to positions of authority quickly took on their roles, even without specific instructions to be controlling. The accepted lesson was about situational power. However, there's another aspect. Once given control, people tend to justify it as necessary. Rescuers do something similar. They create an imbalance and then justify it as caring. This is the lure of moral superiority. You feel essential, generous, and strong. Strength feels good, especially when it's framed as goodness. But here's where things fall apart. The person you rescue doesn't see your inner thoughts. They are reminded of their shortcomings. Some will become dependent, some will rebel, and some will bide their time, waiting for a chance to flip the script. Gratitude is unstable, and debt is dangerous. I'm not saying that helping is wrong. The issue is more subtle. When you step in, whose needs are you really meeting? Are you helping the other person survive, or are you satisfying your own need to feel important? This dynamic is rarely discussed openly. Rescue can be a tool for influence, but it can also invite resentment. Once resentment grows, it doesn't attack directly, it waits. If saving someone creates a hierarchy, and hierarchies always have the potential for reversal, then the real risk isn't that you'll be taken advantage of. The real hazard is that you'll become obsolete. If rescue creates hierarchy, then helplessness can become a source of power. This is where empathy starts to break down because we've been taught that helplessness is a wound and weakness is something to protect. In 1967, psychologist Martin Seligman performed the experiments that led to the concept of learned helplessness. Dogs subjected to unavoidable electroshocks eventually stopped trying to escape, even when escape was possible. The approved conclusion was that organisms under uncontrollable stress internalize powerlessness. They give up. The theory made its way into textbooks, shaped trauma psychology, and influenced education policy. However, here is where theory starts to get blurry. Learned helplessness explains how powerlessness is acquired, but says little about how it can later be used. I started noticing the difference in corporate settings, not in labs. A European logistics firm around 2016, a mid-level analyst frequently said she was overwhelmed. She used the same phrases in every meeting. "I am drowning, I can't handle this. I'm not good with conflict." Managers reassigned her difficult tasks to others to protect her capacity. Strangely, her job was never threatened. Colleagues who missed deadlines without the emotional displays were warned or fired. She was accommodated. Her helplessness gave her immunity. This is the mechanism that is rarely named. Apparent fragility lowers expectations. Lowered expectations decrease scrutiny, and reduced scrutiny protects one's position. Selective incompetence isn't a psychiatric diagnosis, but it's an easy pattern to spot. In family systems research from the 1980s, studies of over-functioning and under-functioning partners showed a consistent dynamic. The more one partner acted incapable in certain areas, the more the other partner compensated. Over time, the under-functioning partner's responsibilities narrowed without any formal discussion. There was no conspiracy, just reinforcement. In workplaces, the pattern is micro-strategic. An employee who always claims to be confused by financial reporting might still navigate complex social situations with precision. A team member who says, "I'm terrible with deadlines," never misses important meetings. This isn't accidental, it's targeted. I recall reviewing internal communication from a startup founder who complained that one of his early hires was constantly unable to handle pressure. During investor updates, this employee would shut down, avoid eye contact, and later send apologetic messages about her anxiety. Yet in casual settings, she cultivated close ties with senior stakeholders, presenting herself as emotionally open but deeply loyal. When layoffs came, she survived. Two high-performing but direct engineers were let go. The approved reason was culture fit. Helplessness had social value. The common explanation is that managers fear seeming cruel, which is true, but not the whole story. There's also a calculated aspect on the so-called victim's part. When you appear fragile, you create a moral dilemma for anyone who challenges you. Criticizing performance becomes an act of aggression against someone who is already struggling. This shifts the focus, and accountability starts to look like persecution. Here, theory shifts again. Learned helplessness assumes passivity, but in many adult settings, what we see is adaptive helplessness, carefully planned. It appears under responsibility, not under opportunity. I didn't expect the distinction to be so obvious until I tracked it across examples. The same person who can't manage a deadline can manage alliances, and the same person who falls apart under feedback can negotiate a salary. In 1998, social psychologist Roy Baumeister wrote about self-handicapping, creating obstacles to protect self-esteem in case of failure. Students who partied the night before an exam could blame their poor grade on lack of sleep, not lack of ability. The insight was framed around protecting the ego, but if you take it into organizational life, you see something sharper. If I publicly mention my struggles before a task, any poor result confirms the story of my struggle, not my incompetence. And if I succeed despite my struggles, I look heroic. Colleagues feel this instinctively. They sit in meetings thinking, if I say I'm overwhelmed, I look weak. If she says it, she gets support. Resentment builds, but there's no approved outlet because questioning vulnerability is socially risky. This is where Machiavellian logic quietly enters, even if no one quotes Machiavelli in the conference room. Machiavelli observed that appearances are key to political survival. A ruler must seem forgiving, faithful, and humane, even when acting strategically. The practiced victim reverses this principle. They seem weak, anxious, and burdened while acting strategically beneath the surface. The appearance disarms, and the strategy strengthens. Families show the same architecture. In multi-generational households studied in clinical sociology during the 1970s, one sibling often played the role of the fragile one, exhibiting illnesses, crises, and emotional ups and downs. Resources flowed their way: attention, funding, and leniency. The capable sibling silently absorbed responsibility. Years later, inheritance disputes erupted, not over money, but over the accumulated invisible labor. The fragile one wasn't powerless, they were central. Here's the uncomfortable pivot. Weakness can anchor a system. I'm not suggesting that all vulnerability is manipulation. Trauma is real, and anxiety is real. Genuine suffering doesn't eliminate the chance of strategic reinforcement. Once a person learns that helplessness brings protection, the behavior continues. This isn't cynicism, it's basic conditioning. The practiced victim doesn't always consciously calculate these things. Sometimes the strategy becomes their identity. I'm the one who can't cope. Identity protects the pattern. Any attempt to change the role threatens comfort and self-concept. And here, the hierarchy shifts again. The rescuer believes they hold the power, but over time, they revolve around the fragile one's crises. Decisions are delayed to accommodate them. Standards are flexible, and the emotional climate follows them. Who is really in control? The practiced victim rarely dominates through force, but through limitation, by narrowing what others are willing to demand. If helplessness can be used as a weapon, then the moral landscape becomes uncertain. Refusing to rescue isn't indifference. It might be the only way to see if the weakness is real or strategic. However, that test is dangerous. If you withdraw help and the collapse is genuine, you look monstrous. If you continue rescuing and the collapse is tactical, you become complicit. Most people, facing that uncertainty, choose the safer image over the clearer truth. If the practiced victim survives by seeming fragile, the next figure is colder, more stable, and more efficient. This one doesn't collapse under responsibility. This one takes resources and remains unchanged. The bottomless taker isn't chaotic, they're functional, sometimes even impressive. That's why they're more difficult to spot. Reciprocity theory suggests that when someone gives, the receiver feels obligated to repay the favor. In 1971, sociologist Alvin Goldner described reciprocity as a universal rule. Later experiments by Robert Cialdini showed how even small, unrequested gifts increased compliance rates in controlled studies. The logic seems solid. Generosity creates obligation. But here's where the model breaks down, because obligation doesn't necessarily lead to transformation. In corporate mentoring programs across Fortune 500 firms in the early 2000s, internal studies often showed that while ments reported greater job satisfaction, mentors reported investing excessive time without seeing measurable reciprocal progress. In several post-program surveys, mentors described a pattern. Advice was sought, connections were leveraged, and introductions were made, but when the mentor later needed political support within the organization, the mentee remained silent. There was no obvious betrayal, just absence. The bottomless taker consumes opportunity without turning that into loyalty. I once reviewed a case at a multinational consulting firm. A junior consultant, charming and articulate, secured a strong advocate at the partner level. The sponsor pushed for her promotion twice, defended her during performance reviews, and assigned her to high-profile clients. Within 3 years, she was promoted. Shortly after, she moved to a rival firm, taking a key client. When asked about her mentor's support, she said, "He believed in me." That's what leaders are supposed to do. The entitlement was subtle, not aggressive or malicious, just assumed. Psychology might explain this through self-serving bias, attributing success to internal traits and seeing assistance as minor. That's partially true, but it misses the strategic aspect. The bottomless taker doesn't reject help. They seek it out. They place themselves where generosity is available and cultivate proximity to resource holders. Once they get what they need, the emotional debt resets to zero. Gratitude, in these cases, is performative. It lasts only as long as the extraction continues. Behavioral asymmetry and emotional effort makes the pattern clear from the inside. In a 2012 study on workplace emotional regulation, employees in caregiving or support roles reported significantly higher levels of emotional exhaustion than those who received that support. When I spoke with mid-level managers in healthcare administration, they described mentoring certain staff members who needed constant reassurance, validation, and advocacy. These staff members rarely reciprocated emotionally. When a manager faced criticism or stress, the relationship flipped and support didn't flow back. The emotional exchange was one way. The same structure appears in personal relationships. One partner consistently provides funding, stability, forgiveness, and conflict resolution with extended family, while the other partner makes promises of improvement and delivers incremental change, never structural change. When confronted, they are mildly surprised, saying, "I thought we were a team. I didn't realize how often the bottomless taker sincerely believes this story." That's the disturbing part. The lack of gratitude isn't always cynical. It's normalized internally as deserved support. Subtle narcissistic supply dynamics help explain part of this. Clinical descriptions of narcissism emphasize grandiosity and lack of empathy, but subclinical narcissistic traits, verified in personality inventories across many populations, include entitlement and a constant need for affirmation without proportional investment. In 2008, research on communal narcissism showed individuals who see themselves as uniquely generous or moral while using a disproportionate amount of community resources. They see themselves as givers, even when their actual support is low. Here, theory almost fails because if a person believes they're being generous while draining resources, confrontation becomes nearly impossible. Any accusation of taking too much is reframed as ingratitude towards them. Financial bailouts provide a large-scale example. After the 2008 financial crisis, several large institutions received public support. Public messages framed these actions as necessary stabilization. Some institutions later resumed high-risk behaviors and executive compensation structures within a few years. Officially, they complied with regulations, but culturally, the lesson learned was different. Importance means rescue. The bottomless taker learns that extraction has no limit. Within teams, this dynamic isn't always apparent in big, obvious ways. Rather, it manifests in subtle, everyday interactions. Think of a coworker who consistently asks for assistance with their presentations, but never offers to help when others are up against deadlines. Or consider an employee who frequently requests flexible work arrangements but doesn't extend the same consideration to their colleagues. Over time, these actions can breed quiet resentment, especially since the taker's performance might be technically adequate. They're not necessarily failing in their duties, but they are consuming more resources and support than they are contributing. This behavior challenges the widely held belief that generosity automatically fosters loyalty. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. Sometimes, acts of giving simply signal abundance, which can attract individuals who are opportunistic and looking to take advantage. A cynical viewpoint might suggest that favor should be strategically distributed to make others more dependent on you while limiting their ability to act independently. If your support empowers individuals to become more self-sufficient rather than creating a sense of reliance on you, you might be inadvertently contributing to your own diminished importance. I recognize that this might sound harsh. For a long time, I resisted this idea, preferring to believe that acts of giving naturally create strong bonds. However, first-hand observations have shaped my perspective. Genuine bonds require shared vulnerability and mutual risk-taking. Exploitation, on the other hand, requires no such reciprocity. The quintessential taker skillfully avoids overt conflict or dramatic failures. They simply continue to advance, accumulating what they can, while leaving behind the unnoticed effort and support that enabled their progress. This situation presents a difficult question for those who are inclined to help. How can you tell when you're investing in someone versus being exploited, especially when the taker is likable, performs well enough, and occasionally expresses gratitude? The absence of sincere appreciation is often subtle and cumulative. It becomes apparent in what doesn't happen. The unreturned phone call, the lack of support offered, the absence of loyalty when it truly matters. If weaknesses can be strategically feigned and gratitude can be insincere, then generosity alone is no longer a reliable guide for making ethical decisions. Instead, it becomes a gamble. And if generosity is just a gamble, then the real question shifts from gratitude to the potential for wider harm. Some individuals possess a kind of instability that not only drains resources but also spreads negativity to those around them. When you offer assistance to such individuals, you risk inadvertently fueling their instability rather than resolving it. I witnessed this unfold around 2014 at a tech startup that had venture capital backing. The founder was undoubtedly brilliant, charismatic, and driven by impulse. The company achieved some early success, but it was also plagued by crises. Missed payrolls, frequent shifts in strategy, and public outbursts directed at senior employees. The lead investor stepped in repeatedly, providing emergency funding, personal coaching, and settling lawsuits quietly. Each intervention was presented as a vote of confidence in the founder's vision. In reality, these actions had a more systemic impact. Every rescue removed the consequences of the founder's actions without addressing the underlying volatility. Within 3 years, the company ultimately collapsed after a final dispute in which the founder forced out key executives and diverted the remaining funds to a personal project. The investor lost much of their initial investment. However, a more far-reaching consequence was its impact on the employees. Dozens of people had based major life decisions, like buying homes and supporting families, on the illusion of stability created by these repeated interventions. To my surprise, many of those employees blamed the investor, not the founder. Their reasoning was logical. He was aware of the situation. he continued to bail him out. This highlights a shift in moral responsibility. By saving one disruptive individual, the investor put many stable individuals at risk. The theory of behavioral contagion can help explain why this occurs. Research in organizational behavior, conducted in the early 2000s, showed that emotional states can spread throughout teams through subtle cues like facial expressions, changes in tone, and decision-making patterns. A study of financial trading firms found that when one highly volatile trader was present, risk tolerance increased across nearby desks. This wasn't necessarily due to rational agreement. Rather, the emotional intensity changed what was considered normal. Instability tends to be infectious. Within leadership structures, disruptive individuals often possess both high levels of confidence and poor impulse control. They make bold promises, escalate conflicts, and view constraints as obstacles to be overcome. This combination often attracts people who want to protect them. Board members, investors, and senior partners step in to manage the chaos. However, this containment can easily turn into enablement. In 1972, the Stanford prison experiment, led by Philip Zimbardo, showed how assigned roles can amplify extreme behaviors. The prison guards became increasingly cruel, not because they were directly told to do so, but because the situation allowed it. When applied to the corporate world, this shows that shielding a disruptive individual from the repercussions of their actions implicitly encourages further escalation. Each instance of misconduct that goes unpunished expands the boundaries of what is acceptable. Employees often sense this dynamic before senior leaders do. Around 2019, I spoke with a middle manager at a manufacturing company. The CEO was known for making erratic decisions, canceling contracts without notice, publicly shaming directors, and reversing policies on a weekly basis. Yet, the board consistently renewed his contract, citing his decisiveness as a virtue. The manager told me, "We've stopped planning beyond the next quarter. There's no reason to. We just wait for the next crisis." That comment has stuck with me. The act of rescuing the CEO had normalized the state of crisis within the company. Official explanations often justify these interventions as necessary for protecting innovation or retaining talent. While this might sometimes be true, there's a hidden cost that's rarely considered: the psychological toll on everyone else. When rules are bent for one person, it weakens shared norms and expectations. Trust becomes conditional. High-performing employees quietly disengage. The entire system starts to revolve around the unstable individual. This is the chaos carrier, someone whose unresolved volatility disrupts the stability of those around them, and whose protection only amplifies the destructive consequences. Research on family dynamics from the 1980s documented the identified patient phenomenon. In this scenario, one family member displays extreme behavior, like addiction, aggression, or chronic crisis, and the entire family structure reorganizes to manage that person. Siblings may suppress their own needs, while parents divert resources. Although the family may appear unified, their connection is based on defense. The chaotic individual becomes the focal point. Rescuing them doesn't lessen their influence, it reinforces it. I've witnessed situations where boards have argued that removing a disruptive founder would send the wrong message to the market. They fear the immediate consequences but underestimate the long-term damage. Each rescue reinforces the founder's belief that they are indispensable, and that belief, without any constraints, breeds a sense of entitlement. A strategic viewpoint devoid of emotion would pose a different question: Does keeping this individual benefit the overall stability of the organization, or does it undermine it? A leader once cautioned that excessive leniency toward disorder can ultimately lead to greater suffering later, since unchecked chaos will require a harsher response. Here, the issue becomes uncomfortable. If removing one individual protects the well-being of many, then showing compassion to that one person becomes unfair to the group. However, if the chaos carrier also generates value, such as through innovation, charisma, or vision, the action is no longer simply good or bad. It becomes a strategic choice. I've seen organizations hesitate for so long that their hesitation itself became harmful. Talented employees left proactively, and investors quietly withdrew their support. The disruptive leader interpreted these departures as signs of others' weakness, and protection turned into isolation. The chaos carrier rarely views themselves as destructive. They may see resistance as a form of betrayal. Every time they are rescued, their view is strengthened. I am not understood, but I am essential. Once this belief takes hold, it doesn't diminish, it intensifies. This marks a critical point. When you rescue someone whose instability spreads to others, you're no longer just showing personal generosity. You are shaping the psychological environment of an entire organization. The question then shifts from whether that person deserves to be saved. Rather, the question becomes, what price will others have to pay for it? If saving one person can put many at risk, there's another, even more personal issue. The instability becomes subtle. It doesn't cause explosions in boardrooms. It whispers. The manipulator does not want things. He wants your soul. Emotional coercion has been examined over decades, but researchers approach it with certain assumptions. They name it dependency, fear, or emotional damage. Those names are not wrong, but they're not complete. They don't describe with precision how people can use vulnerability. In the 1990s, psychologist Susan Forward popularized the term emotional blackmail to label actions based on anxiety and guilt. The design was easy. If you do not accept, you are hurtful. If you leave, you are a horrible person. The value of the design is that no one sees it. I saw someone who wanted a separation from his wife, but his wife was always in a problem. The wife had health problems and also told all of the friends about it. The man felt like he was caught because everyone would think he was a bad guy for leaving. He became the bad guy. That sentence catches the chain. During the 1970s, Murray Bowen wrote about how anxiety can spread a family. When someone hurts, other person may begin to feel the pain too. What was called anxiety can evolve into influence tactics. The most crazy person becomes the center. Their pain starts the behavior of people. I did not think kids would learn it either. Someone found that kids who do emotional things like loud, crying get help than the others. It is human when they are babies. When they become big, it becomes trouble. People in a company are sly too. When they have to fix the performance, employees start talking about parents and stress, and they were not wrong. It was just good time. The boss always holds back feedback. This gives bad feelings. The people who do good feel that the work is not shared well. People are given easy time while others are not. Here is the trick. Companies may say they do empathize, but empathy without rules become not fair. When things are not fair, it creates hate. This will destroy control. The bad person realizes that others do not wish to be known and accused. Since I state to you that you leaving is cruel, I make your identity into weapon. You must choose between being safe and being you. Courts in the United States were seeing parents with drama. One parent wanted to show they were with bad emotional stats. They say that the other is cold. Court would pick the emotional one. The choice was to fix pain that was seen. Being seen is good. That is where manipulation meets flaw. Manipulators need to look compassionate. They appear wounded and take over at the same time. The wound becomes like weapon. A boss I know talked to a partner of his who would quit when fights happen. Every problem was said with hurting sentences. It was all about debt and not plan. The boss said he gave up because he felt it was bad of him to not help the partner. Feeling bad becomes money, and force becomes guilt. When you're guilty, it triggers social working. Science shows when you're bad, you will help more and pay. The criminal uses the thing that helps people. By having you believe they are bad, they get you to fix it. Here is something even worse. The criminal thinks he is right too. They feel pain. This makes design stronger. It is not the bad guys from cartoons. You mix up who you are with how you can get the upper hand. It can get bad for the victim. People say they have to be careful around the criminal. Others say to change what you will say. Those underneath do not provide input. The hole narrows around who reacts more. Real help is free will. From influence tactics, it becomes not. From that, it is control. The question is cruel. If you are selfish, you will look ruthless. The more good you wish to be, the most better the steering. What is upsetting is how seldom people say that all of this should be fixed faster and with help. Make C becomes excuse. Excuse becomes get away with it. Once you are in chain, then the questions become unable to look away. The one with the power or the on who says that strong is as bad as cruel. If flaw changes toughness to cruelty, the worst is still quiet. Nothing is seen or loud. Just wait. The parasite can't cry, threaten, or get exhausted. They attach to you. During the Renaissance age, people took control from patrons. Machiavelli told of the risk. When somebody has no influence and they support others, they can get switched out. Guards attract figuring. Protection attracts ambition. What makes me think is how someone can stay faithful slow. Around 2011, an Asian group had problems. For a while, a helper executed the ideas of the creator. They approved everyone in front. They did good while the creator was assigned. Once the creator had problem with health, the said leader shaped partnerships, set new plans, and got people known to the outside. It took him months to swap out leaders that were in the company too long. Nothing was not legal. The moments were timed right. Employees reported feelings of confusion and disorientation when a senior manager remarked, "We saw him as the stable one." But it turns out that image of stability was just an act. From a psychological point of view, this isn't quite the same as narcissistic behavior or blackmail. It's more about strategic compliance. Studies on how primates organize themselves show that individuals lower in the group will sometimes act in a friendly way, showing respect and building alliances before going after the top position when they see an opportunity. This show of compliance isn't about giving up. It's about figuring out the lay of the land. In businesses, this happens often under the guise of helping potential leaders grow. A senior person picks someone they want to guide and develop. The younger worker copies how the senior one talks, uses similar words, and publicly praises them, all while making connections with others at their level. They also learn where the weak spots are in the company and figure out who is really important versus who is just there to look good. I saw this happen firsthand at a financial institution in Europe around 2015. A deputy director always seemed extremely loyal to the CEO. He was always ready to take on difficult projects, kept the little problems away from the CEO so they wouldn't have to worry, and acted like he was very responsible and skilled. But what most people didn't realize was that he was secretly talking to members of the board who weren't happy with how the CEO was leading the company. When the company's performance started to decline, the deputy didn't try hard to defend the CEO. Instead, he offered himself as someone who could keep things steady. Later, the CEO said that he was surprised by how things turned out. But it wasn't that surprising when you consider that he mistook the deputy's loyalty for a lack of ambition. Here's where some theory can help us understand what happened. The idea of social exchange suggests that people invest in relationships to get something good out of them in the long run. But it usually assumes that things will even out with each person giving and taking. In situations where power is at play, knowing how to position yourself is more important than giving and taking. If I can get access to information, learn new things, and gain trust by being respectful, I can get closer to being in charge. This is something we don't often talk about directly. Pretending to be dependent can be a temporary strategy. Machiavelli warned leaders not to give too much power to people who have their own support system. He said that those in charge should make sure that their ministers owe everything to them. If not, gratitude will disappear once other support systems appear. Modern guides for how companies should be run use nicer words, like succession planning, shared leadership, and common goals. But the risk is still the same. People lower down in the company usually sense this shift before the leaders do. Middle managers often notice when a deputy starts going around the normal chain of command to be efficient. Coworkers can tell when praise becomes too much or when someone seems to be agreeing just for show. But because the person is acting respectfully, it seems cynical to be suspicious. No one wants to accuse someone of being ambitious just because they're acting humble. I've been surprised by how often leaders mistake obedience for a lack of ability. In surveys from the late 2000s, senior leaders consistently thought that their immediate deputies were more loyal than they actually were. Meanwhile, the deputies said that they were planning to move up in their careers. This difference was very noticeable. Leaders saw silence as dedication, while deputies saw being close to the leader as a way to gain power. There's also a more personal side to this. In mentoring relationships, the younger person will sometimes accept being patient for a long time. They take roles that don't get much attention, learn as much as they can, and then make a move when the time is right. The mentor sees this move as a betrayal, while the younger person sees it as growing and developing. From an outside perspective, it's hard to say whether this is right or wrong. Wanting to move up is not a bad thing, and advancing in your career is normal. But when someone uses submission as a way to hide their true intentions, the person trying to help them might get the balance of power wrong. The person seeking power by being a parasite doesn't take obviously. They grow silently within the structure. By the time it's clear that they are independent, the system that supported the original leader has already been changed. And here's something that bothers even experienced leaders. The qualities we praise in those we mentor, loyalty, adaptability, discipline, are the same qualities needed to carry out a shift in power without causing a major disruption. If appearing weak can be an act, and loyalty can be temporary, we realize that what we thought was true is not. Protecting someone doesn't mean you control them, and being close to someone doesn't mean they're loyal to you. Sometimes, the person who seems the most obedient is just waiting for the right moment to take over. And if that's unsettling, there's another type of person who is even more confusing. This person doesn't want your protection, not because they are strong, but because being saved goes against who they think they are. For some people, their suffering is not just the situation they are in, it's who they are. In 1957, Leon Festinger introduced the idea of cognitive dissonance. This means that when our actions and beliefs don't match, it creates stress, and we try to fix it by changing either what we do or what we believe. It's a simple idea that explains why smokers downplay the dangers of smoking, or why members of a cult will find new meanings when their prophecies don't come true. But when we apply it to the idea of saving someone, it shows something more complex. If I see myself as someone who is always overlooked, betrayed, or a victim, then being saved messes up my whole story. Being saved creates a conflict within me. I saw this in a number of cases between 2010 and 2020 involving people recovering from addiction. People who had always seen themselves as rebels, outsiders, or victims struggled not only with getting off drugs, but also with figuring out who they were. In programs designed to help them, when things started to get stable, regular sleep, a steady income, better relationships, there were more cases of relapse when people felt confused and lost. Doctors thought this was because of the stress of adapting. That's partly true, but listen to how some patients describe being sober. I don't know who I am without the chaos. That's not just about the body's reaction, it's about their story. If chaos is how you prove you're real, then being rescued feels like you're being erased. Research on self-sabotage supports this idea. Studies in 2006 showed that people look for feedback that matches what they already think about themselves, even if it's negative. People with low self-esteem preferred partners who thought poorly of them rather than those who praised them inconsistently. It felt safer to be seen in a way that matched their own view of themselves than to be seen as better. I was surprised by how strongly this plays out in professional life. Around 2018, I watched a senior engineer at a large company who kept turning down promotions. He said it was to keep a good balance between work and life. But he also showed anger toward the management and took him being the only one who tells the truth. Every time the leaders tried to give him more responsibility and pay, he resisted in subtle ways, missing meetings, sending confrontational emails, and refusing to give tasks to others. Eventually, he was passed over. From the outside, it seemed unfair. But from his perspective, it kept his image as the honest outsider. The person trapped in their own identity fights against help and sees it as a threat. In relationships marked by destructive loyalty, particularly within close social or political groups, members will sometimes ruin opportunities that would separate them from the shared struggle. Research on people leaving gangs in city areas has shown that some individuals turned away from real work opportunities because success would make them strangers to their group. The cost of being free was being exiled. Being rescued requires changing. Changing requires leaving the old self behind. Not everyone is ready for that emotional death. This makes the moral questions even harder. In earlier situations, rescuing someone just gave power to those who would manipulate or cause trouble. Here, rescuing someone might be genuinely good but still not wanted. In families where hardship has been passed down through generations, a child who tries to move up in the world through higher education, moving away, or gaining financial independence often faces subtle opposition. Comments are framed as concern. Don't forget where you came from or you're changing. Studies on people who move up in social class show that first-generation graduates often feel guilt and separation. The family story depends on shared struggle, and leaving threatens that connection. Imagine trying to save someone whose sense of belonging depends on staying hurt. I remember a woman in her early 30s who stayed in a nonprofit job that paid poorly, even though she had the skills to do much better. Friends offered to introduce her to people in the corporate world, but she refused. She described herself as someone who chooses meaning over money. Yet she often complained about not having enough money. When gently asked about other options, she became defensive. "I'm not like those people," she said. Her resistance was not about money. It was about her identity. From Machiavelli's point of view, identity is the strongest way to control someone. If I can fix you to a story about who you are, the loyal one, the victim, the rebel, the martyr, I don't need to hold you back physically. You will control yourself. But when you try to rescue someone whose identity is based on suffering or opposition, you're not offering help. You're suggesting they get rid of who they are. That's why some people mess up rescue attempts. They miss deadlines after getting mentorship, relapse after getting financial help, or go back to harmful partners after interventions. It's not because the help wasn't enough, but because the help required them to become someone else. Here's where theory struggles. Psychology often focuses on empowering people, yet empowering people can mess up fixed identities. The person trapped in their identity sees being empowered as being exiled from their own story. For colleagues, partners, and leaders, this is frustrating. "I gave them everything," they say. What they gave was opportunity. What they threatened was their sense of self. And now the discomfort gets stronger. If not everyone wants to be free, and some people defend their limitations as proof of who they are, then rescue becomes an intrusion. You're not just changing their situation, you're challenging their story. The final question is unsettling. When you try to save someone, are you sure they see it as salvation or as an attempt to rewrite who they are? Because if identity fights against being rescued, forcing it only makes the prison stronger. If some people refuse rescue because it threatens their identity, then another question becomes unavoidable. What happens to the one who keeps trying to save them? At what point does kindness stop being a virtue and start becoming self-destruction? I used to think the answer was simple. Compassion is good and refusal is cruel. But power doesn't work based on simple slogans. It works based on imbalance, and imbalance changes everything. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo ran the Stanford prison experiment. Everyone remembers the guards becoming abusive. Fewer people talk about the good guards who try to help the prisoners. They burned out first, became isolated, and were subtly pressured by both sides. Their attempts at fairness messed up the fragile structure of control. Kindness, inside a system built on dominance, became a disadvantage. I didn't expect that detail to be so important, but it is, because rescue shifts power balances and systems punish those who cause instability in their organization. This is rarely discussed in leadership seminars. Think about high-performing corporate environments. At Netflix, when Reed Hastings openly said that their culture was adequate performance gets a generous severance, it shocked many people. Brutal, unforgiving. Yet inside the company, it created clarity. Leaders were trained not to spend too much time trying to save employees who were consistently underperforming. The logic wasn't cruelty, but about dividing resources. Time, attention, emotional energy, these are limited. Every hour spent trying to save someone who resists growth is an hour not spent on those who increase value. Here's where the moral trap gets tighter. If you refuse to rescue, you feel heartless. If you continue rescuing, you quietly drain yourself and mess up the structure around you. Understanding boundaries shows this tension with uncomfortable clarity. In 2014, researchers at the University of Michigan studying compassion fatigue among medical professionals found that those who gave too much emotionally without firm boundaries experienced higher burnout and reduced effectiveness. The nurses who tried to save everyone didn't become saints. They became exhausted, cynical, and detached. Kindness without limits turned into worse care for everyone. The cause is not mystical, it's economic. Attention is a currency. Status is a currency. Emotional labor is a currency. When you give them out without thought, you devalue them. Machiavelli understood this long before organizational psychology put it in nicer terms. In The Prince, he warns that a leader who tries to be loved by everyone will lose the ability to be strict when necessary. Too much kindness shows weakness, and weakness invites pressure, and pressure concentrates on the most empathetic person in the room. I've seen this happen in middle management more times than I can count. A team member consistently misses deadlines. The manager is understanding. Personal issues. Another chance, then another. The rest of the team notices and adjusts their effort downward. Anger builds. The manager makes up for it by working longer hours to protect both sides. Within months, performance drops across the board. The original underperformer remains unstable. The manager, meanwhile, is exhausted and quietly blamed for weak leadership. Psychology might call this poor boundary setting, which is correct but not the whole story. The deeper issue is the imbalance of power. The rescuer takes responsibility for things that the other person refuses to own. Control transfers silently. The one who appears compassionate becomes structurally subordinate. There's that challenges the moral narrative even further. In 2009, Adam Grant at the University of Pennsylvania published research on givers and takers in workplace environments. The surprising discovery wasn't that givers succeed, but that they occupy both the top and the bottom of performance rankings. What made the difference? Strategic discrimination. Successful givers invested in high-potential collaborators and set firm limits with exploitative personalities. Unsuccessful givers helped indiscriminately, mistaking generosity for a universal obligation. This is where theory starts to break down. We're taught that refusing help defines our moral worth. But in complex systems, rescuing everyone creates overall weakness. It rewards dysfunction, shifts incentives, and punishes self-sufficiency. I remember talking to a founder who nearly bankrupted his startup, trying to keep a charismatic but unpredictable executive. The executive delivered occasional brilliance, but constant disruption. The founder believed loyalty required patience, and severance felt like betrayal. Meanwhile, investors lost confidence, and senior staff left. Only when the founder finally terminated the relationship did stability return. He told me something that stuck with me. I thought kindness was strength. It was fear of being seen as ruthless. That sentence rarely appears in leadership literature. Refusing to rescue is not automatically strategic. Sometimes it's laziness disguised as toughness, or cruelty justified as efficiency. The distinction lies in recognizing patterns. Is the person capable of growth but temporarily struggling? Or are they incentivized to avoid responsibility? The former responds to support, while the latter consumes it. And here lies the burden for ordinary people. Not leaders, not executives, but partners, colleagues, siblings. When you continually rescue someone who avoids responsibility, your nervous system adapts. You scan for their crises, anticipate their failures, and your emotional baseline shifts from stability to vigilance. Over time, your identity reorganizes around containment. This is how quiet resentment is born. Kindness is considered a virtue in relationships, but in power dynamics, compassion must be rationed or it becomes leverage against you. The refusal to rescue can be cruelty, but it can also be strategic intelligence, preserving your capacity so that your influence remains intact. Here's the question that disturbs me. How many systems, companies, families, political movements fall, not because of malice, but because their most conscientious members can't bear the guilt of withdrawing? We like to imagine that survival and goodness naturally come together. History tells us otherwise. And if kindness is a resource, not endless, then every act of rescue carries a cost. The real danger may not be that some souls can't be saved. It may be that saving them gradually damages the structure that supports everyone else. If kindness has a cost and identity can resist rescue, then the conclusion is structural. It's not just about kindness or obligation or morality in a sentimental way. It's about protecting influence and how influence protects itself. Look back at the 6 types we've discussed. The addicted victim drains attention without accountability. The bottomless taker takes without gratitude. The chaos carrier spreads instability through rescue. The moral blackmailer turns empathy into a tool. The power parasite hides ambition under submission, and the identity prisoner refuses liberation, defending their self-concept like a fortress. Each is different, yet each operates on a shared principle. Rescue is never neutral. It creates debt, either real or emotional, and debt establishes power. I've seen this in startups, nonprofits, and families. A CEO bails out a failing project repeatedly. Employees understand that instability is tolerated. The leader's generosity, intended as kindness, becomes a tool for manipulation and resentment. Social psychologists in the early 2000s called this resource contingent control. The more one gives, the more the recipient's behavior adapts, sometimes negatively. The more you save, the more power diffuses unpredictably. You are indebted, accountable, both protector and hostage. Hierarchy emerges from this cycle. The person who controls rescue determines obligation. Behavioral economists have shown this repeatedly. In studies of charitable giving and social lending, recipients of repeated help adjust their effort downward, not out of laziness but in response to expectation. Each intervention creates a structure of authority. Each deferred consequence is leverage. The rescuer becomes a hub of compliance, but the leverage is double-edged. Resentment builds from those saved, those observing, and those excluded, waiting for opportunity. History, corporate boardrooms, and even family courts are full of sudden reversals that seem irrational only because the root was hidden. Debt, hierarchy, and resentment create vulnerability. Rescue produces power in one way and risk in another. This is Machiavelli's pragmatism. Generosity can stabilize or destabilize, protect or endanger. There is no virtue in action, only consequence. Think about a tech firm in 2016. A visionary CTO repeatedly bypassed process, producing brilliant code but creating chaos in product timelines. The CEO intervened to protect him, reassigning teams, absorbing delays, and defending decisions to the board. Initially, the company thrived on innovation. Within 18 months, high performers had left quietly. Investors pressured for stability. The CTO, emboldened by repeated protection, made a strategic pivot that alienated customers. The CEO's kindness had created hierarchy and resentment. Stability collapsed through accumulated consequence, not malice. Psychologically, this makes sense if you track debt and obligation. Social theorists call it normative leverage. You give, and someone else owes. Neuroscience supports it. Functional MRI studies from the late 2000s show that when humans experience social indebtedness, reward circuits activate differently than with voluntary exchange. The mind codes repayment not as choice, but as demand. Hierarchies are encoded in brain structure, subtle, persistent, and invisible. So, the final teaching comes together. Power isn't maintained by universal mercy, but by selective intervention. Choosing who to save, who to let fail, and who to observe becomes strategic. Every act of rescue creates obligations, hierarchies, and potential reversal. Ignoring this is to confuse virtue with vulnerability. And here's the unsettling idea. Systems, organizations, even networks survive not because everyone is protected, but because someone chooses which failures are tolerable and which must happen. Kindness becomes a management tool, compassion a lever. To maintain stability, you must decide, sometimes coldly, who will fall. It is not cruel if it preserves order, nor virtuous if it produces chaos. In the theater of human influence, the distinction between morality and strategy is more than subtle. It's how things work. And one more thought, the less obvious your generosity, the less it can be used against you, but the less it can be measured as mercy. Power protects itself by shaping outcomes invisibly, allocating rescue with discretion, and letting others carry the cost of their choices. In the end, the difficult question remains. When you hesitate to save, are you failing morally, or are you acting in a way that preserves everything else?